In the spotlight tonight, the biggest book of the year, Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. Joining me now, the author of the definitive biographies of Benjamin Franklin, Albert Einstein, and now Steve Jobs, Walter Isaacson. Walter, thanks for joining me tonight. You know, I worried about you, when you were working on this book, because I figure I'll give Walter a shot. I'll give him some publicity, try to sell a few books.
Thank you, sir.
Turns out this is already like the biggest selling book in the history of the printing press. Right?
But it's because of Steve Jobs, not because
it's
of
Steve
me.
Jobs, yeah, okay.
I mean, you have to remember this guy emotionally connected with people.
He did, and the timing of the book coming out shortly after he kind of shocked us. We all knew he was sick. But the news came to me when I was preparing this show in Burbank, actually, about just minutes before we were going on, and I just knew we had to clear out that whole hour to do this. Even though we kind of knew it was coming, it was still very shocking.
And I was particularly surprised at the huge global emotional outpouring. We all knew the guy had cancer, but even when I visited him the last time, a few weeks ago, he thought he was going to stay one lily pad ahead of the cancer, and I kept thinking, okay, he'll be around next year.
Well, he was an eternal optimist about everything he was approaching, wasn't he?
He also used that as a tool. I mean, he sort of, it was called the reality distortion field. He would say, you can do this. You can code this in 4 days.
Right.
And they say, no way.
We had Wozniak on the other night.
I know
that story.
That's in the book, the Woz story about made him do it in 4 days. Breakout. I saw him on your show. Woz is so cool.
And he stayed with that method through every product they were developing, right? He just kept pushing it faster than anybody thought it could be done.
And sort of connecting the poetry to the engineering in ways that nobody could have thought you could have made an iPad that powerful.
We have some Twitter questions for you.
Sure.
Susie P99 says, did Jobs regard any one of his game-changing devices as his favorite or best effort or signature piece or legacy?
His signature piece or legacy, he told me, was not any device, but the company. He said that he discovered that in America, if you're going to have creativity and change and innovation, you have to actually have a company that can make it work, where people aren't afraid to fight and be brutally honest and have new ideas. And he said people like Zuckerberg, Mark Zuckerberg, who did Facebook, he really respects because he's trying to build a company, whereas other entrepreneurs kind of just try to do a product and see if they can sell it.
In your book, he says this, I hate it when people call themselves entrepreneurs, when what they're really trying to do is launch a startup and then sell or go public so they can cash in and move on. They're unwilling to do the work it takes to build a real company, which is the hardest work in business. That's how you really make a contribution and add to the legacy of those who went before you.
You're right. He just said it better than I did.
He really did make things. Where would his heart be watching these Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Oakland protests, which have never been protests against what Steve Jobs was doing? They're protesting against these people down on Wall Street who just rub money together all day.
One of the interesting things was during the Occupy movement, when he died, all of a sudden the people who were down in Zuccotti Park and others, they all go into mourning. And here's a guy who had made billions, was a great capitalist. And yet, I think what the distinction is exactly what you just said. He made money by making products, making products that he thought were insanely great, not doing it just to make the money, as opposed to using your engineering skills to make financial instruments that somehow cause a collapse of the housing market.
And sticking with the company, like
correct, exactly.
To Fox News. You knew I was going to get there.
Hey, what took us so long?
This is also from the book. Jobs got Rupert Murdoch to hear him out on Fox News. You're blowing it with Fox News, Jobs told him over dinner. The axis today is not liberal and conservative. The axis is constructive, destructive. And you've cast your lot with the destructive people. Fox has become an incredibly destructive force in our society. You can be better. Who else could say that to Rupert Murdoch?
And you know what? Murdoch, I talked to Murdoch afterwards, and he said, well, I hear that from, Jobs is sort of a liberal. I hear it all the time. But, Murdoch and Jobs respected each other in a way, because Murdoch, for all of his, sort of old-fashioned ways, he immediately started creating things with the iPad, sort of jumped on the digital revolution. I think Jobs' main point there was sort of, there were certain shows, I won't name names, on Fox that he said just tore people down. And I think he felt that way in a broader sense, that we've now reached a time in our society where people don't try to build institutions, there's a lot more tearing down than there destructiveness than there is constructiveness.
And Steve Jobs was an Obama supporter. He offered to help with the 2012 campaign.
You remember
ads.
Hal Riney's ads for Morning in America for Reagan?
Yeah.
That's what he wanted to do. He wanted to do ads like that for Obama, both in 2008, and was a big supporter before he died. Wanted to make ads for 2012, and he wanted to do it with sort of that grand branding message he did with the 1984 ads or the Think Different ads. There's an amusing conversation, not in the book, but when he talks to Axelrod about that, and I'm not sure Axelrod got a word in edgewise, and I'm not sure it was the best.
And why isn't the conversation in the book?
I found out about it last week.
Oh, okay. There's that. Yeah. I guess I know who you found it out from now. He talked about the president with you. Talked about President Obama. He talked about his frustration in listening to the president talk about things sometimes and explaining why they couldn't get done. And what I read in that is the president is explaining the politics of why they can't get done, especially on the DREAM Act, for example, which Steve Jobs was a big supporter of.
Right. He said you can't do the DREAM Act unless you do it in the context of, visa reform, immigration reform. Steve Jobs had a way, as we said earlier, of just pushing whatever he wanted. If he felt that the Macintosh could be out by January, somehow or another, everything would happen and magical thinking would get it out by January. You cannot do that in government. The last meeting I had with Steve before he died, we're talking about a variety of things, and then he says, somehow Obama comes up, and he says, the problem with Obama is he just won't piss people off, won't get them mad, he won't really anger them. And, I wasn't thinking politics, I was thinking Steve Jobs. And I looked at him, he said, I know what you're thinking. That's not a problem I have, right?
Right. So, but did he grasp that difference that, yes, Steve Jobs could push people beyond their limit because he is their boss, they're on his payroll, they work for him. A president cannot go in to congressmen of the other party and say, you have to do this.
Well, yeah, he understood that in a divided government, in a democracy, you couldn't rule that way. In the early 1980s, there was somebody who worked with him and clashed with him and said he would have made an excellent king of France. Yeah. That's exactly what Steve Jobs would have made. He would not have made an excellent president in a divided democracy like we have now. And I think he understood what Obama was faced with.
Tell me about he had an encounter with his father before he knew that the man he had the encounter with was his father. And then he said that he researched his father eventually when he did the tracking down, and he found out who the man was. And he researched the man and didn't like what he was finding about him, and therefore chose to never meet him or have any contact with him. What was it that he found about him that he didn't like?
His father had abandoned, his mother, had abandoned the sister, the younger sister that they had, who turns out to be the novelist Mona Simpson. So Steve is enchanted by the notion. In his late 20s, he discovers that he's the brother of Mona Simpson, this wonderful artist. So these
and he knew about Mona Simpson's work before?
Not really. Mona had not yet published anywhere but here, but she was just about to. It's the year that was being published. She was working for the Paris Review, for George Plimpton. And the mother calls and said, I haven't told you this, but you have a brother, and he's just tracked me down, but I'm not going to tell you who he is. But he's rich, but he used to be poor, and he has dark hair, and he's really famous. And everybody in the Paris Review tries to guess who it is for a couple of days, and they come up with John Travolta, and it ends up being Steve Jobs.
Yeah, I think it's a better outcome for everyone involved.
But let me just tell you
what happened with the father, though?
So Mona tracks down the father. The father is running a coffee shop in Sacramento, California. He was born in Syria, had been a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin. That's when, he had these two children, then abandons the family, running a coffee shop in Sacramento. You can't make this up. Mona goes there. Steve doesn't want to have anything to do with him. And he says to Mona, he starts crying, and I'm sorry about all this. He said, I wish you had seen me earlier. I used to have the best restaurant in Silicon Valley, right near Cupertino. Everybody used to come. Even Steve Jobs used to come. And Mona, taken aback, doesn't say, Steve Jobs is your son. And she just looks shocked. And he says, oh, yeah, he was a great tipper. She goes back and reports that to Steve. Steve says, oh, yeah, I remember that guy who ran that restaurant, that balding Syrian guy. Never spoke to him again.
Wow. Walter Isaacson, president of the Aspen Institute and the author of the book, Steve Jobs. Walter, thanks for joining me tonight. Are there any of these left in a bookstore? Are they still available for sale in America? They're all sold out, right? They're gone.
Lawrence.
All right. We're going to sell a few.